In terms of absolute and relative truth, which is something we did talk about to remind everybody, that this idea that certain dimension of experience is unconditional, so it would be outside of the realm of the skandhas in the way that we talked about them and the eight consciousnesses. It's just the moment by moment awareness that, as Noel said, has no real locus. It has no real permanence. It has no identity, and yet it is vivid. There's things that we say about it in Tantra: luminous, clear, and empty. So there is a field of experience that's described in Buddhist language that goes beyond the linear progression. That would relate to what we call the unconditional absolute truth. In other words, there's not much you can say about it, but your experience could be, you could be introduced to that level of experience, but it would be called transmission rather than a kind of a book you would read.
Oh, and
So
would you relate that to? I'm curious, and I have to admit to my noviceness when it comes to the Buddhist psychology. Would you relate that experience of like tapping into awareness as like no self, or how?
yes, you wouldn't have time in that experience to create that kind of relational situation. It's all coming at once. And so
Mm,
one thing that it's talked about is in the tantric Buddhism, it's called the pointing out the nature of mind. It's pointed to, it's transmitted as an experience that you can introduce into the person's field of experience, but not by describing it particularly. You could set it
mm.
up with a description, but the experience itself is, you'd have to push somebody off a cliff or something like that to do it properly.
Right. Is that what
And
like instead of the more extreme shoving someone off of a cliff, was that
yeah, yeah.
sort of part of the
Everybody,
purpose of
metaphor
right.
alert,
It is
please.
metaphor
Yeah,
the metaphorical cliff shoving. I'm so curious like because I have uh done some light studying of like Zen Buddhism.
sure.
And I was reading about I was reading like Zen koans, and
Yeah,
like the purpose of the Zen koan in a way is to kind of like disrupt it. It
yeah,
interrupts all of
yes.
that narrativization and all of that. It's like so there's like a something there's like a luminosity about the sitting with it that interrupts that stream of.
Well, or the teacher could directly intervene, or the situation could be created in which it became obvious that the
Mm,
continuity that we're relying on it has been experienced in uh, as not being continuous, but is sort of chunk. You're into the gap between the chunks,
the
right?
gap.
The
Okay.
gap is the easiest way to talk about it.
Yeah.
So and that would be then you're experiencing what would be called the absolute kind of quality of existence, and the relational quality is, okay, well, now I got it with this conversation is going to go over. I'm going to invite everybody to ask questions and answers. You get back into that mind, and hopefully that mind is not, you know taking over your life to the point where you're just stuck and stranded with conventional reality the way you were doing it. Yeah, this is the way we always do it. We go to Q&A now. That some of the
Yeah.
aliveness of the absolute
Sure.
reality could permeate the relational one. And
Mm,
here's the thing, Doc: the two are absolute and relative. This was a teaching I got a long time ago and was fascinated by it. Is there's a third truth?
hmm,
You wouldn't think so, right?
hmm. I'm
What would it be?
I'm getting
Yeah,
closer.
what would it
No,
be?
tell me. I don't know.
Right through the screen.
Yes, tell me.
it, it's called the inseparability of the two truths.
Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah.
So if we try to get the absolute truth and that kind of sense of glow and vibe, but we miss the relational dimension of experience,
Mm,
this has been called spiritual bypassing, which is where I
yeah.
wanted to get us to.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is there, what's your understanding of bypassing? Like all these things we're talking about, is it possible we're creating another web of kind of intrigue and missing an opportunity to have a real penetration into the experience
hmm
by describing
Do
it?
you? do you want sort of my neuroscience hat on with that,
Yeah, yeah, sure.
or hmm. I mean, to go back to the conversation that we were having about stress, right, and homeostasis in the body. Um, One of the impacts that meditation has been shown to have, just in terms of the stress research, is the lowering of cortisol. And cortisol being the body's primary stress hormone, right? So when your body is flooded with cortisol, right, that is part of what is like lending itself to that experience of chronic stress or chronic pain, and inflammation. So essentially, you're calming, you're lowering those levels of cortisol, and that is able to like introduce like a greater quality of the feeling of like safety into the body, and the feeling of calm, and like you're open to connection, meaningful connection, right? But I think that you can go a little bit further with that, and just in my own experience, like I don't know if I did most of my training and retreat practice at Spirit Rock, which is just outside of San Francisco in California. And I remember, you know, uh, being on a 10-day retreat, and I had this experience a few hours into meditating where I the feeling of Sarah and the feeling of I just completely dissolved. There were no thoughts, there was no body, there was no separation between me and the meditation hall and the earth. It was just pure vastness, and I have no idea how long I was in that state for. Um, it was like an experience of emptiness and fullness all at the same time, and it felt so liberating, I guess I would say. Like all of the, I'll just be honest, like I came to my meditation practice as a person who had suffered from like lifelong, like very intense depression and anxiety and trauma. And so for me to have that experience of like total like surrender and integration into the everything was wild, because it went beyond anything that I had ever. I didn't know that that was possible, and it's one thing to read about it in the research; it's a whole nother thing to have the subjective experience, right? But what I found was that as the sense of me and as the sense of I began to return, I wanted to cling on to that absolute. I was like, oh no, give me more. Oh, it's so good, And then I would sit down on my cushion, and luckily that there were very like skillful teachers there who, when I was able to ask a question, they would be like, yeah, that experience of clinging and wanting to grasp onto it, that too is a part of the noticing. That too is a part of the practice, right? So I think that from the point of view of the neuroscience, and I'm just kind of like speculating here, we live in a culture that is like really built upon like selling and marketing things to us that are like really going to give us that hit of like dopamine, right? That hit of pleasure, and that are like really meant to like shift our mood. And serotonin would be like the neurotransmitter that is like really like modulating that, right? So I think that there could be a way that like when we do tap into these experiences of the absolute from the point of view of just like our brain structure and function, we could then seek that, and then we could then start to make that kind of like the goal of the practice, right? um, and then that introduces that hook and that grasping, and I think is then taking us away from like the practice, which is really like a practice of constant remembering to be with what is.